The sun had long since stopped shining in the Reid household, not because of weather or curtains, but because joy had quietly packed its bags and walked out 11 months ago, leaving only shadows behind. Ivy Reid stood on the marble staircase, watching her son from above. Noah, just 6 years old, sat cross-legged on the living room floor. He wasn't playing. He wasn't watching TV. He just sat, staring, clutching the same paper Crane his father had folded for him before boarding the helicopter that never came back. He hadn't spoken since the funeral. Not one word. Not even a nod when Ivy tucked him in at night or when she whispered, "I love you," into his hair, begging for something, anything in return. The house was too big, too quiet, and too full of grief. Ivy turned away, pressing her lips together as her heels clicked softly down the hallway toward the kitchen. Every room reminded her of Daniel, her husband, the man who saved lives across the world and was taken in a freak accident during one of his humanitarian missions in Mozambique. The crash had made headlines. Hero surgeon lost in tragedy. Thousands mourned. But Ivy and Noah had been left behind with more than just condolences. They'd been left with silence. And silence, she was learning, was louder than grief. In the kitchen, the smell of lemon cleaner lingered in the air. Grace, the quiet woman who'd taken over housekeeping duties months ago, was rinsing a rag under warm water. She looked up and nodded politely. "Morning, Mrs. Reid," she said, her voice soft with a lilting accent Ivy still hadn't placed. "Morning, Grace," Ivy replied absently. She picked up her untouched coffee from the counter and stared into the dark liquid. Cold. Something caught her attention. A faint sound, music? Humming? She followed the noise, curious. It was coming from the laundry room. There, sitting on a stool, Grace was folding towels while gently humming an unfamiliar tune. Something slow and warm. Foreign. African, maybe? It had a rhythm like rain falling on a rooftop. And at her feet, cross-legged on the floor, was Noah. He wasn't speaking, but he was watching. His eyes tracked the movement of her hands as she creased the towel, tapped her foot in rhythm, and sang softly. His fingers twitched, mimicking her folding motion. It lasted barely 3 minutes. But it was the most Ivy had seen Noah react in nearly a year. She backed away quietly, heart pounding in her chest like a drum. Was this it? Could it be that Grace had reached something she couldn't? That evening, after Noah had gone to bed, Ivy approached Grace in the kitchen. The woman was drying her hands. She smiled politely, as always. "Is everything all right, Mrs. Reid?" Ivy didn't answer immediately. She pulled out a chair at the table and gestured for Grace to sit across from her. "I need to ask you something unusual," Ivy said slowly. Grace tilted her head. "Of course." Ivy swallowed. "My son hasn't spoken in 11 months. Not to me. Not to anyone. But this morning, when you were humming in the laundry room, I saw something. I saw him respond to you." Grace blinked, but said nothing. "I've taken him to every therapist, every specialist. But nothing has worked," Ivy continued. "So here's what I'm asking." She took a breath. "If you can bring my son back to me, if you can make him smile again, genuinely smile, I will give you $1 million. Grace froze. $1 million? Ivy nodded. "I'm not trying to insult you, or by a miracle. I just don't know what else to do. I'm willing to pay anything, to see him be a child again." Grace sat in silence for a long moment, her eyes thoughtful but unreadable. Then she leaned forward slightly. "You don't need to pay me," she said, voice low. "But I'll try." From that day, everything changed. Grace began arriving earlier. She no longer just cleaned the house. She became a presence. She baked simple bread from scratch and let the smell fill the halls. She whistled when she dusted. She laid out wooden carvings on the kitchen counter, tiny giraffes, elephants, turtles, and let Noah play with them when he crept into the room. Noah, at first, remained silent. But he watched and followed. One morning, Ivy found him holding one of the carved giraffes in his hand, tilting its head toward the sunbeam that filtered through the kitchen window. And then came the humming. Grace had a song for everything. Folding towels, making pancakes, watering plants. Sometimes she didn't even use words, just sounds and rhythm. Ivy caught Noah mimicking her, tapping the counter with a spoon in sync with her steps. One rainy afternoon, Ivy stood outside Noah's bedroom door and heard something that made her knees go weak. Laughter. Soft. Breathless. Real. She cracked the door open. Inside, Noah was sitting cross-legged on his bed, and Grace was crouched beside him holding up a silly, crooked giraffe puppet made from old socks and buttons. "What's his name?" Grace asked gently. Noah opened his mouth and whispered, "Oliver." Ivy nearly dropped to the floor. Later that night, after Grace had gone home, Ivy tiptoed into Noah's room. He was asleep, curled under the covers with Oliver tucked under his chin. She sat on the edge of the bed and gently brushed a curl from his forehead. Then she whispered, "Thank you." But it wasn't to Noah. It was to the quiet woman who had somehow, impossibly, reached into her son's broken world and started sewing it back together. The next morning, Ivy approached Grace in the hallway. "I meant what I said," she told her. "The offer still stands." Grace shook her head gently. "Mrs. Reid." "Ivy," she corrected. "Please, just call me Ivy." Grace smiled. "Ivy," she said, "I'm not doing this for money." Ivy frowned. "Then why?" Grace turned, her eyes misting for the first time. "Because someone once did the same for me." Ivy opened her mouth to ask more, but Grace was already walking down the hall with her basket of clean linen. That night, Ivy opened an old photo album. She hadn't touched it in months. Inside were pages of Daniel's humanitarian missions, photos in Haiti, Cambodia, South Sudan. Smiling children, makeshift tents, a few blurry selfies with locals. One picture stopped her cold. It was Daniel, years younger, standing next to a young woman in Kenya. He was smiling, his white doctor's coat dusty, and his hand rested on the shoulder of a girl who looked about 20, holding a baby in one arm and a carved wooden elephant in the other. The girl's face was thinner, but the eyes, the smile. It was Grace. Her heart pounded. Was this how they knew each other? As the wind whistled softly through the trees outside, Ivy looked toward her son's room where she heard soft humming again. Same rhythm, same peace. And suddenly, she knew. This wasn't just healing. This was something deeper. Something connected. Something her husband may have set in motion long before he left this earth. And maybe, just maybe, he was still healing them now. The next morning, Ivy brewed a fresh pot of coffee for the first time in weeks. Not the one the housekeeper usually made, but herself with her own hands, a sign that something inside her had shifted. It wasn't just about the coffee. Something else had cracked open in her, a feeling Ivy hadn't dared entertain since Daniel's death. Hope. She walked through the hallway, barefoot, drawn by a sound that had become more common in the last few weeks, Noah humming. The tune was one Grace had sung a few days earlier while kneading dough in the kitchen. Noah had sat on a stool nearby, swinging his feet and tapping the rhythm on the marble countertop with a wooden spoon. Now, he was humming it again, lying on his stomach on the living room carpet, sketching with crayons. Ivy peeked over his shoulder quietly. A turtle, a crooked tree, a little house, and a woman. In the center of the drawing was Grace, unmistakably drawn in her green apron and flowered scarf. Ivy blinked. She stepped back, suddenly unsure of how she felt. Relieved? Jealous? Later that day, Ivy invited Grace for tea. They sat in the sunroom. Ivy watched as Grace stirred her tea with slow, careful motions, like each swirl held a secret. "Can I ask you something personal?" Ivy said. Grace looked up. "Of course." "How did you know how to reach him?" "Noah." "How did you know what to do?" Grace's eyes drifted to the garden outside, where a robin was hopping across the stones. "I've seen that look before," she said softly. "The one Noah had when I first came here. It's not just sadness. It's silence that grows roots. You have to cut it gently, bit by bit." Ivy leaned forward. "You've worked with children before?" Grace hesitated, her spoon pausing. "Yes," she said finally, "but not as a job, as survival." Ivy tilted her head. "Where?" Grace looked back at her and smiled faintly. Far from here. In a place where children stopped smiling because smiling could get you hurt. Ivy felt a chill. She didn't press. But she could tell there was so much more to Grace than what she showed. That week, the changes in Noah were undeniable. He began to speak to Grace in full sentences. Short but clear. Can I help with the dough? I like the elephant carving. Grace, sing the rain song again. He still didn't speak much to Ivy, and that hurt deeply. One evening, after Grace had gone home, Ivy tried reading Noah his favorite story from when he was younger. He just stared past her and said, "Can Grace read it instead tomorrow?" It felt like a knife to the chest. But Ivy smiled. Of course, sweetheart. She kissed his forehead and left the room. She couldn't sleep that night. So she opened the old storage closet in the study, the one filled with Daniel's field journals, travel photos, and scribbled notes from his time overseas. She rummaged through the dusty boxes until she found what she was looking for, a leather-bound notebook with Daniel's name pressed in gold on the cover. She opened it, flipping past pages of sketches, notes on surgeries, and journal entries. Then she found it, a page titled, Kenya, Grace. Her heart raced. Young woman, burned hands, carrying niece. Name, Grace Mwangi. Courageous. Brilliant with kids. Taught me how to fold animal puppets from banana leaves. I gave her my jacket. She said I looked like a lost goat. Ivy laughed through her tears. Told her if she ever makes it out of that place, she should find me. Told her to call Ivy, because she's the real hero. She said she'll never forget. Ivy closed the notebook, trembling. Grace hadn't just wandered into their lives. She had come with a purpose. The next day, Ivy watched Grace in the garden with Noah. They were planting marigolds, their hands dirty and their faces glowing. Tell me again what it means, Noah asked. Marigolds are the flowers of memory, Grace said. We plant them to remember the people we love. Ivy stepped forward. May I help? Noah looked up. He hesitated, then handed her a small trowel. Okay, Mommy. It was the first time he'd called her that in nearly a year. Tears welled in her eyes. She knelt beside them and started digging. Later that afternoon, Noah brought Ivy a new drawing. She unfolded it slowly. In the picture was a plane flying over mountains. Below it, a little house with sunflowers. Ivy, Daniel, Noah, and Grace. There was something else, a small detail in the corner. A wooden drum, carved and round, with swirling designs. Ivy stared at it. She had seen that drum before. She rushed to the attic, flinging open boxes until she found a smaller chest labeled Mozambique, Kenya, Laos. Inside were the trinkets Daniel had brought home over the years. She shuffled through hand-woven scarves, old notes, and carvings until her fingers landed on it. The drum. The exact same one from Noah's picture. She clutched it to her chest. That night, she waited for Grace by the door. When the woman arrived for her evening cleaning, Ivy met her in the foyer, the drum in her hands. Grace froze when she saw it. You knew him, Ivy whispered. You really knew him. Grace's face went pale. Ivy, you were the girl in the photo, she said, voice trembling. From Daniel's journal. You saved children during war. You taught him how to help them. Grace stepped forward, tears rising. He saved me first. Why didn't you say anything? Grace looked down. Because I didn't want pity or reward. I only came here because I needed to repay a debt. But when I saw Noah, broken, quiet, I knew this wasn't a job. It was a calling. Ivy pressed the drum into her hands. You've given me my son back. Grace shook her head. He came back on his own. I just showed him the path. That night, Ivy couldn't stop thinking about it. About how Daniel, even in death, had orchestrated this connection. How his kindness years ago had rippled forward through time and across continents to bring them Grace, the very person who would heal the hole he left behind. This wasn't just a coincidence. It was a gift from beyond the grave. The next morning, Ivy walked into the kitchen as Grace was preparing breakfast. I want to give you something, she said. Grace turned. I told you. I don't want the money. It's not about the money anymore, Ivy said. I want you to stay. Not as an employee,
but as part of this family.
as someone Daniel trusted, as someone we love. Grace was silent. Then she nodded slowly. Yes, she whispered. That night, Ivy tucked Noah into bed and sat beside him. Do you remember Daddy's drum? She asked gently. Noah nodded. Grace has the same one. She does, Ivy said, because Daddy gave it to her. A long time ago. Noah looked at her. So, she knew Daddy? She did. And he knew she'd help us. That's why she's here. Noah didn't respond. He rolled onto his side and held the giraffe puppet to his chest. Then, softly, he whispered, I think Daddy sent her. Ivy smiled through tears and kissed his forehead. I think so too. Grace had lived a life full of silence. It was a different kind of silence than Noah's, not one of grief, but of survival. The kind that taught you to hold in your voice to protect what little you had left. But here, in this bright house filled with ghosts, her silence had finally met its match in a 6-year-old boy with wide, wounded eyes. And slowly, as Noah had begun to heal, so had she. 2 weeks after Ivy discovered the truth about Grace's past, the house felt warmer. Not just from the sun shining through the windows or the fireplace roaring during the evening, but from the laughter. Real, bouncing laughter that came from Noah. It wasn't constant, but it was there. Enough for Ivy to believe they were no longer just surviving, they were living. One morning, Ivy walked into the kitchen and found Grace quietly slicing mangoes for breakfast. Noah sat on the counter, legs swinging, naming each piece of fruit as it was placed on the platter. Mango, banana, strawberry.
He paused.
What's that one? Papaya, Grace said, smiling. Papaya, Noah repeated, proud. Ivy leaned against the doorway, hand over her heart. She couldn't remember the last time she had felt this much love in her chest. And she needed to do something with it. That night, she pulled out Daniel's will and her own. She stared at the words, the clauses, the cold legal language, and then picked up a pen. She made changes. Big ones. The next morning, Ivy took Grace to the garden and sat her down. Do you remember the first day you stepped into this house? She asked. Grace nodded slowly. You said you just needed work. You said you were grateful for the opportunity. But you gave us more than just clean laundry and folded sheets. You gave me my son back. Grace smiled but said nothing. I've revised my will, Ivy continued. If anything happens to me, you'll have permanent guardianship of Noah. And whether I'm here or not, you'll have a home here forever. Grace's face crumbled. Ivy. It's not charity, Ivy said firmly. It's what Daniel would have done. What he did do for you. And what you've done for us. Grace didn't speak. She only reached over and took Ivy's hand, squeezing it hard. 1 week later, Ivy announced something that took Grace by surprise. We're starting a foundation, Ivy said, in Daniel's name. But not just about surgeries or medicine. This is about healing the way you do it. Grace blinked. What do you mean? A place for children who've experienced trauma. A safe space. Music, storytelling, art, puppetry, food, rhythm, joy, Ivy said, her voice growing with conviction. Not pills. Not white walls.
You.
Your methods. Your love. Grace's hands trembled slightly. I wouldn't know where to begin, she whispered. Start the way you started with Noah, Ivy said. One song at a time. The Daniel and Grace Foundation launched just 2 months later. The press couldn't get enough of it. A beautiful story about grief, second chances, and the unexpected woman who'd stepped out of the shadows to save a boy's broken heart. The gala event was simple but elegant. Photos of Daniel hung along the walls, showing his missions across the globe. Next to them were sketches Noah had made, drawings of animals, gardens, Grace and Ivy standing beneath the sun, and, of course, the wooden drum. At the center of the event, a small stage was set up. Ivy walked to the microphone first, her voice shaking but strong. Most people think heroes are loud, she said. They're not. Sometimes, they hum lullabies in kitchens and fold towels in silence. Sometimes they bring life into a house you thought was dead. And sometimes they walk into your home with a mop and quietly rearrange your soul. Tears welled in the audience. And then they become your family, she said, looking at Grace. Thunderous applause. But it was what happened next that no one expected. Noah stood up from his chair, walked to the microphone, and tugged at it until it lowered to his height. He cleared his throat. The entire room held its breath. He hadn't spoken in public. Ever. He looked at Grace. Then at the crowd. And with a soft but steady voice, he said, "Thank you for saving me. Thank you for saving my mommy. Daddy sent you. I know he did. I love you, Mama Grace." The crowd gasped, then cried, and then stood, all at once, in a roaring ovation. Grace covered her mouth with both hands, sobbing silently, as Ivy rushed forward to hug her. Noah joined them, wrapping his small arms around both women. A family, whole again. 3 months later, the foundation had opened its first center. Children from local shelters and grief groups attended daily sessions, drumming circles, poetry classes, puppet workshops, therapy gardens. Grace was the heart of it all. Every wall told a story. Every window invited the light. Every corner whispered the love of a man who is no longer there, and a woman who carried his kindness across the world. One afternoon, Grace sat with Noah in the foundation's playroom. He was carving a new giraffe with a tiny pocket knife she'd gifted him. "What should we name this one?" Grace asked. Noah tilted his head. "Daniel," he said. "So I'll always remember him." Grace smiled through her tears. "You don't need a giraffe for that, baby," she said. "He's already inside you." That evening, as Ivy stood at the top of the stairs watching them, Grace and Noah laughing on the floor, surrounded by wooden animals and music, she whispered into the quiet, "Thank you, Daniel, for sending her, for saving us twice." And for the first time in a long, long while, the house felt full of life again. Not just noise. Love. The end. Please subscribe, like, comment, and share for more interesting stories.